Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be talking Firebase and Clerk. So Clerk just released a new Firebase integration into their product. So this allows you to use the beautiful Clerk UI alongside your Firebase application, such as Firestore or the Firebase real-time database, etc. So if you're ready to learn how to integrate both Clerk and Firebase together, stick around as we dig into it. So here we are in a standard create next app application, and nothing has changed currently. So the first thing we need to do is add all of our packages. So you can pull up your terminal and type yarn add @clerk /clerk react, and then we just need Firebase. Once those have installed, I'll meet you back in the application where we can start talking about how Clerk works and then how the integration with Firebase works as well. So now that we've made these changes, we need to wrap our application in the Clerk provider and also check to see if Firebase has been launched already, so that we don't run into a weird error that happens when you use something like Next.js, where it tries to initialize the app multiple times. So we're going to import Clerk provider signed in and signed out. I'm not going to go into too much details about all of these pieces because I've done 2 previous videos on these, and I'll throw a description link up. And basically I go through how to set up a Clerk provider and how to use sign in and sign out, and also how to use custom self-mounted versions. So we're also going to need use router, and that's because part of this protection is that we send the user to the login page regardless. So I'm basically making anybody that wants to use this application log in, and there are other ways to do this. You can actually just not have certain pages be public and other pages be public, and I also cover that in some previous videos. So we also need use effect, and we'll be using that from React. And then we're going to need the Firebase import, and we need that from Firebase/app. And then finally, we're going to need to import a configuration, and we haven't built this yet, so I'll just leave this as an empty string, and then we can talk about this piece once we've built this whole piece out. So what we're going to do is first, we're going to say if Firebase apps .length. So if there isn't any length here, we want to initialize the app with our configuration, which comes from Firebase app. And this config is going to be something that you set up in Firebase, which I'll show you when we get there. Else, what we want to do is say Firebase.app. Now this is a thing that's happened multiple times to me, and basically what happens is if you don't use something like this, the Firebase app, they'll try and create this app over and over again, even though it's already been initialized. So now we have that. We need to create a couple of consts here. We'll create one called Clerk Frontend API, and we'll leave that blank for now. And we'll also create another const here called Clerk Sign In URL, and we'll leave that blank as well because we're going to get these from Clerk. Then I'm going to put const public pages and equal them to an empty array. And this is a way of telling it basically, hey, I don't have any public pages on this application. So if someone tries to go to, say, localhost 3000/app, then if they're not signed in, then just redirect them, and we'll handle this part down in this section. Then we need to create a function that actually does the redirect. So we can do a function here and say redirect to sign in. And inside of that, we can just use the use effect that we imported at the top and say window.location equals clerk sign in URL. And what that will do is it will force them to the sign in URL page. And then we'll return null. So that's our redirect sign in done. And now we actually need to essentially wrap our whole function here and protect the routes by using the Clerk provider. So we're going to do a const route here, and inside of this use router function, we're going to say return. And what I like to do so that I don't accidentally mess something up here is I'll take this and just drop it down here so that I don't forget about it. Then what we can do is say Clerk provider front end API is equal to Clerk front end API. Then we say navigate equal to, so that's the history, router.push to. And that basically says, hey, this is the toString, and let's push to that directory using the router from Next.js. Then inside of this wrapped, we can now essentially handle whether or not this person is signed in or not. And that's part of the power of Clerk. We can say public pages dot includes router dot path name. Then component and page prop. So we can just copy this and drop it in here. And so that basically says, hey, if this public page is included in this router.path name, we can just go ahead and immediately send the user there. Now, if they're not there, and there's nothing in our pages here, so we know that this is never going to happen, but we should have it there anyway, because maybe you want to add one in the future. Then inside of this section, we can say, just put a little fragment here, and then say if they're signed in, which remember is something that we imported at the top, then we can also throw a copy of this. Otherwise, so if they're not this, they have to be signed out. So we can do signed out, and then what we can do is do redirect to sign in, and that will force them to the sign in page. Now that's everything on this page that we need to do, but let's talk about a few things here. So what we've imported is the Clerk provider sign in and sign out. We've also imported this Firebase application, and then we've added a few features such as router and use effect from React. And then we have this configuration file that we need to set up. Then we ask the application to check if the Firebase app's length is not true. Then we can go ahead and initialize this application. So do that part again. Cut. So then we go, if the Firebase app.length is not true, we want to initialize the application. Otherwise, we just want to use the app. Then we're creating two constants here that are going to come from an environment. So these will probably be like process.env next public Clerk front end API, and then we'll call this one next Clerk sign in, and we'll get those from Clerk in a second. We've then said that there are no public pages because this array is empty, but if you put a directory in there, that would be available through public pages. I then created this function here called redirect to sign in that essentially uses use effect and basically sends them from whatever page they may be trying to get to back to the sign in URL. Then in our actual function for my app, we've wrapped the whole application in a Clerk provider, added this front-end API and the navigate that will push them where they need to go. Then, using a if-else statement, we've basically told them if it's in the public pages, go ahead and show it. If they're signed in, go ahead and show it. Otherwise, redirect them back to this sign-in. And that's the end of our My App. So going from here, what I should do now is go ahead and show you how to set this up in Clerk and then how to set it up in Firebase. So I'll meet you over on the Clerk's website. So I've created an application here called Clerk with Firebase. And so far I have done one thing, which was to set up Firebase, but I'm going to go through the steps again. And the reason is that I want all of these configurations ready for our application. So if you remember from the process.env, we did two. One was the front-end API and was the sign-in URL. So we need both of these to go into our environments. So make sure you copy and paste those into a env.local on your Next.js application. So now we've covered that part, let's talk about how integrations work. Now, integrations at Clerk, they currently have two for databases, and then they have one for webhooks about user sessions. So we're going to be talking about Firebase. Now, the way this works is when you turn it on, this Manage Integration page shows up. Now, you have to either upload a JSON or type all of these fields in manually. Now, these come from Firebase. So I'm going to switch over to Firebase and show you how to get this so that you can upload it to your Firebase integration through Clerk. So I'm in the Firebase application. I've called it Clerk with Firebase. And in the authentication, I've just made sure this is turned on. So when you click it, it will initialize this, and that will allow a user to be able to use the functionality that comes along with Clerk. Then what you need to do is go to your project settings here and make sure that you grab this config, and we're going to drop this in our config file that comes along in that app.js, which we can talk about once we've gone through these steps. But make sure you write this down so that you have it. Now what we need to do is actually use a service account. Now what a service account does is it allows you to do something with this admin, which allows you to verify whether or not they're allowed to do stuff, essentially through the databases, storage, auth, and all sorts of things using the admin SDK. And that's what Clerk is using to verify whether or not this person is allowed to do something. So you click this generate new private key, and it's going to say your private key gives access to projects, Firebase services, etc., etc. Please never show it in a public repository. So click generate key, and it's going to generate this Clerk with Firebase JSON. You can come to this dashboard, click upload JSON, find that file, and upload it. And then once that's done, you hit apply changes, and now your Firebase integration is ready to go. So now I'll meet you back in the application where we're going to put in our config file, and then we can talk about how all of it works together. So I'm back in the application, and let's talk about this config file. So I've created a folder called config, and inside of that, we're going to create something called firebase.js. And then we're going to go back to our Firebase application if you've already forgotten, or in my case, I need to copy and paste it. We're going to take all of this Firebase conv, and we're going to put it in this JS. So we can take this and say, give me all of this configuration, and we're going to do export const, and we'll call it config, and we'll paste this in, and we'll just remove the name here and hit save. Now, one thing to note is this is perfectly safe to have in your front end at any point. This does not actually stop anybody from doing anything, and it's perfectly safe to have it in a public repository, unlike the admin side, which is not safe to put in a public repository. So now we've done that, we should just import it here. So we can just do /config/Firebase and hit save. Now make sure that you have both of these in a .env local. So do .env.local. And then make sure that you have both a front-end API and a Clerk sign-in. So put those in, and then I'll meet you back here and we can talk about what's next. So now our app is set up, ready to be used with the Firebase integration. Now, there's an assumption here that you have some sort of Firebase Firestore or some sort of database that you're using. So for this example, I'm going to show you what I'm using. I'm using the Firestore database here. I have a collection called example, and then I have a couple of documents that have my favorite drinking them. So one is Raz Energy, and the other one is Coke, and my favorite foods are Chinese and pizza, although I never drink Coke, but Raz Energy is my favorite energy drink, so I guess we're pretty close. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to request this data using a hook to get the data out. So back in the code, let's create a new folder here called hooks. And this is the part where our integration actually starts to work with Clerk. So I'm going to call this details.js. So inside our details.js hook here, we need to import a few things to start. First, we need Firebase, and that comes from Firebase/app. We also need to tell it that we want to use Firebase/Firestore. And we'd also like to use auth, so import Firebase/auth. And then finally, we want to use user, so use user, and that comes from Clerk React. And we also need use effect and use state, and that's coming from React. So now we have all of that. We can do an export const use details, because that's what we're going to call it. We're going to then in our function, we're going to create a Clerk user. So we can do const Clerk user equals use user that we just imported at the top. Then we need our states. So we'll do one called details and set details. And that's going to be set to use state. But we're going to use an array here because that is what's returned from Firebase. Then we can say const error set error, and we'll just equal that to use state, and we'll set it to null. So now we have a way to track the details that come from there, and if there's an error, we also have that. Then we need another const here, and this is going to be db, and it's going to be firebase.firestore, and that will give us access to our database. So now we've done all of this. Now we actually need to use something to retrieve the details from the database using our Clerk token. So to do that, you will need to use effect here. And there's plenty of ways to do this. You could have done it with SSG or something like that. Or SSR, sorry, which I've done a previous video on as well. So in use effect, you can do const retrieve details, and we can do an async function here, and then we can say try, and we can say const Firebase token is equal to await Clerk user dot get token, and then we just tell it we want Firebase. Now you can see that Hazura here is also an option, and that's the other integration that you can use. And if you'd like a video on how to do Hazura integration, I can certainly do that for you too. So we'll put in Firebase here. And now we're going to tell it that we're going to use an await function here to essentially check and sign in using Firebase. So you can do firebase.auth and then .sign in, and there's this thing called customtoken, and all we're going to do is pass down this Firebase token that we just created. Now that will give us the ability to actually do something with the database now that we're securely logged in. So now we can just say temp details is equal to an array, and then we'll do const example equals await db collection, and then you give it the collection name. So in my example, I have example, and then we can do .get. Now this is going to get everything from that database. Then we can just say, hey, example.map, actually for each detail, we're going to set the temp details. So we're going to set this dot push detail dot data, and that should give us the ability to essentially use what is being returned. So now we have this part. We need to make sure we close out in the right section here. So now that part's done, what we can do is then set the details. So say set details to temp details. And now we can guarantee that anything that comes from the database is now set here. And then we need to do a catch and say catch. And inside of that catch, we can just say set error to the error. And then we'll set the catch to also to that. And at that point, we're essentially ready to return the details back. So after this use details, we need to, after this use effect, we actually need to make sure that we're calling this retrieve details. So what we can do here is underneath, before we close it, we can say retrieve details, and that will make this run. And then we need to make sure that we close out with an empty array. Otherwise, it will continue to run even when it's finished. And then all we need to do is return the data that we want. So we can just do return details and error and hit save. So now we have this fully functioning thing here that will essentially log into Firebase and then do something with an application. So let's talk about it one more time. So we're importing 3 things from Firebase: the app, the store, and the auth. And this could vary depending if you're using real-time database or not. Then we're using use user from Clerk React, and then use state and use effect. We're essentially saying, hey, Clerk, get me the user, and also set these 2 states and connect to the database. Then what we want to do is retrieve what's in our database. So we're saying, please return this Firebase token from this user. Then go ahead and authenticate with Firebase by signing in with a custom token. Then we want to create an array with temporary details, and we're going to go to our database and say this collection example, let's get everything in it. Then we're going to go through all of that data and push it to this temp details. Then we're going to set details to that temp details. So that part is now ready. So now what we want to do is modify the index.js to use this hook in a way so that we can retrieve the data. So all we need to do to use this now is to import use details from hook details. And then we can use it anywhere in our application. So what I've done is I'll just quickly create something in our main here, and we'll change this to welcome to Clerk with Firebase, so we know what application we're in. And then we'll delete this, and we'll keep one of these and delete the rest. So now we have this grid here. We can actually use this grid. So what we can do is do details by doing. So what we can do now is use the details here to create details. So we can just do const details error equals use details. And now we can use this wherever we want. So we can just say details dot map, and then we can tell it what we have here. So we can say favorite drink, comma, favorite food. And that will give us our favorite food and favorite drink. And then we can use this functionality however we want. So inside of here is where we can start just providing some sort of div or something to be returned. So we can do return and do div. And we should give it a key. So we'll give it a key, and the key will be favorite drink plus favorite food. And inside of this div, we can then give it a class name as well. So we'll just use the class names that come pre-provided here. And we'll do styles.card. Never fails to use styles.card. And then we can close out this div. And then inside of this div, we can do something here. So what I'll do is do an H2. And we'll say favorite food and drink. And then inside of here, we'll just do a P. And we'll just say favorite food. And then we'll copy and paste this, and we'll change it to favorite drink. And hit save. Now at this point, this is all ready to go. There's no more work to be done. So let's launch the application and see if it works the way we expected. So here we are in the application, Clerk with Firebase. I'm going to sign in here. Contact me at jamesperkins.dev and the password. And what we should see is the application data then shows up. And there we go. Favorite food and drink, pizza and Raz Energy, Chinese and Coke, and that's come right from Firebase. So there we have it, guys. Firebase and Clerk together working really, really nicely. Now this leads to a great experience for your users because Clerk offers so many powerful features such as their user management and a bunch of other stuff. So if you did enjoy this video, make sure to drop it a like, comment down below on more things you want to see in the Jamstack, and until next time, see ya!